All right, hi everybody. Today I want to talk to you about a pyramid or pyramids of biomass in ecosystems. And before I start in on that, I need to remind you a couple of things about life. First of all living things, whether it's a plant or animal or fungus, all living things require energy. All living things use energy. Number two, anytime you take energy and convert it from one form or another, there's always a loss of energy as it moves from one place to another. Quite often that escapes as heat. So often this is referred to as the second law of thermodynamics, or sometimes people will mention this as a measure of entropy, which is a measure of disorder, and they'll say entropy is always increasing. Now, when we look at this pyramid of biomass, if you look at the base, at the bottom of this, you'll notice in this particular terrestrial pyramid of biomass, we have the largest section being photosynthetic plants. One of the big important things they do is they do this process called photosynthesis, where they take sunlight, the energy from sunlight and carbon dioxide, and they convert that into chemical energy that can be used by all the other organisms, including the plants. So the sun, in many ways, the sun is the ultimate source of energy in nearly every single ecosystem, with a couple of very rare exceptions, like at the bottom of hydrothermal vents, photosynthetic organisms such as plants, which are also called autotrophs. The term autotroph, troph means feeding, auto means self. So autotrophs are things like plants that can do photosynthesis. And photosynthesis in plants is about 1 to 2% efficient, which means that with all the sunlight hitting the earth, you only get a small, about 1 to 2% of that energy being able to be converted into chemical energy by photosynthesis. So in this particular ecosystem, if we had a particular area in which we could grow, say, 100,000 pounds of plants, at the next level, your heterotrophic organisms, the first primary consumer, if you will, the herbivores eating the plants. In this case, our first heterotrophic organism is this ground squirrel here, and because of that second law of thermodynamics I mentioned, the ground squirrels are only about 10% efficient, which means if you had 100,000 pounds of plants, you could only get about 10,000 pounds in ground squirrels. Then if you move to the next level, the coyote, once again, is about 10% efficient. And in this case, we have our coyote being our carnivore and our secondary consumer. Really, the coyote is an omnivore, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later on. But to keep it nice and sort of linear for now, our coyote is this secondary consumer, and if you had 10,000 pounds in ground squirrels, that would only be enough energy to support 1,000 pounds of coyotes. And then once again, at the next or tertiary consumer, our mountain lion is only, once again, 10% efficient. Your mountain lions are eating coyotes. You could get about 100 pounds in your mountain lions, and since mountain lions weigh somewhere between 80 and maybe 110, 120 pounds or so, that means basically you could only have one mountain lion if you had 100,000 pounds of plants. So we start with that, and again, that's a terrestrial ecosystem. All right, this is a pyramid of biomass for an aquatic ecosystem such as in the ocean, and you notice at the base of this pyramid, instead of plants, we have these phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are usually small unicellular organisms that do photosynthesis that make up the base of aquatic food chains. Examples of these are things like diatoms pictured here. And in this particular case, you'll notice that there are 5 different trophic levels. So once again, we have the sun driving the photosynthesis of the phytoplankton. Once again, it's 1 to 2% efficient. And then as you move up from phytoplankton, we have herbivores and then small carnivores, which could be some type of small fish eating another type of fish. And we work our way all the way up to the 5th trophic level, where in this particular case, big, large predatory fish such as tuna and sharks and swordfish make up our apex predators at the top of the food chain, or the pyramid of biomass in this case. So a term I'd like you to know that's important for sort of comparing or analyzing pyramids of biomass in different ecosystems is this idea of what we call primary production, which is a measure of the rate of photosynthesis in a particular ecosystem. So as an example, deserts, which tend to be limited on the amount of water that they receive, can produce about 200 pounds of edible vegetation per acre per year, because once again, deserts by definition tend to lack water and rainfall. To do photosynthesis as a chemical reaction, you need water. Tropical rainforests, on the other hand, the same amount of space in 1 acre, because they have so much more water, they can produce 10,000 pounds of edible vegetation per acre per year, because they aren't limited by the water in that particular case. Okay, really quick here, a couple examples of producers. Remember, producers are things that do photosynthesis, and we also call those autotrophs. On the right, you have a Douglas fir in an old growth forest, typical terrestrial ecosystem. And over here on the left, you have this diatom, which again is a type of phytoplankton in marine ecosystems. A primary consumer might be something that is like this Roosevelt's elk, and that is an example also of a heterotroph. Remember, heterotrophs are organisms that eat other organisms. And then a secondary consumer, another heterotroph. In this particular case, we talked about mountain lions. And so you could have an ecosystem in which you had the Douglas fir that then was the food source for the Roosevelt elk, and then the Roosevelt elk could be the food source for this mountain lion as your apex predator. We also mentioned, remember, coyotes. I had mentioned that coyotes are what we really call an omnivore. And so the idea that one organism feeds just at one level on the pyramid of biomass is a little bit sort of basic. And although there are some organisms that do that, there are many that feed at many different levels. So as an example, a coyote is a true omnivore in the sense that it is easily both a primary and a secondary consumer. And depending on food availability, coyotes in many places, believe it or not, 70–80% of their diet can be plant material such as leaves or fruit or other parts of a plant. And then in other places they'll eat small mammals like the gopher we had mentioned before. Decomposers are also important, and so in this particular case, this is a log that has sort of washed ashore in Costa Rica from a tropical forest, and you notice all these mushrooms on it. And mushrooms, along with other organisms like termites and bacteria, are considered decomposers because they break down biomass, they break down organic material into smaller pieces that can be used and absorbed by plants and other organisms. This is a trophic pyramid, or a pyramid of biomass of an African savanna. We're going to watch a video about an African savanna. So I want to show you this one. In this particular one, it's kind of interesting because they also show you the phosphorus, nitrogen, and water recycling portions at the base below the primary producers. And you have an impala and a wildebeest, and then you have a lion as your secondary consumer, and then you also have, on this particular case, you have a human that is the top apex predator. Okay? Now, quite often what we'll talk about is that, and this is particularly mentioned in the video you're going to watch, but there are some populations. We mentioned that the producers determine how many herbivores you have, and the herbivores then determine how many predators you can have. But in terms of the activity, quite often one particular population is regulated by either the organisms above them in the pyramid of biomass, that's called top-down regulation, or they are regulated by the organisms below them, that's called bottom-up regulation. Small ungulates, like these Thompson's gazelles, being hunted by these cheetah, small ungulates, they're quite often controlled in part largely by what's called a top-down regulation, because the amount of cheetahs therefore regulates how many Thompson's gazelles you have. Now in bottom-up regulation, once again, you could have a scenario in which your wildebeest population is actually somewhat controlled by the amount of producers. And in the video you're going to see that there's actually two different scenarios of wildebeest in this case, and in some cases they are bottom-up regulated, and in other cases they are top-down regulated. Some very, very large herbivorous animals, particularly in the African savanna as examples. Those include animals like the hippopotamus, the giraffe, the rhinoceros, and the African elephant. These are very, very large herbivorous animals. They are very much regulated by the amount of plant material that is available in that ecosystem. Other than when they are small, say a baby giraffe or a baby elephant, once they are full grown or large, they are really too big for most predators to really control them. So they're very much, the mega herbivores are very much a bottom-up regulated. The last thing I want to mention here is if you go to the southern hemisphere, there are a large number of penguins that you probably are familiar with. Well, in the northern hemisphere, there are these similar looking birds but unrelated to penguins, and they're called puffins. This particular bird here is the Atlantic puffin, and puffins and other seabirds have been declining population-wise in recent years. But once again, if we look at this pyramid of biomass, we see the sun coming in as the ultimate source of energy in our planet, in this ecosystem, driving the photosynthesis of these diatoms, this type of phytoplankton called diatoms. And then there's an herbivorous copepod, which is a small, little, tiny organism that kind of resembles an insect in a sense, but it's a little bit different than that. It's an arthropod. This copepod is a small little animal that is a type of zooplankton that eats this phytoplankton, and then there are small fish, the sand eels, that eat the small copepods. And the copepods are a concentrated source of a protein, of proteins and omega-3 fatty acids. And this little tiny animal copepod organism, it hibernates, and it lives on the fat reserves during this hibernation. So what ends up happening is you end up with in one scenario, without global warming, you have these higher fat copepods, and with global warming, you have these lower fat copepods. So what does that mean? We don't have as many diatoms because you lack the ice, and you have this low fat copepod because of global warming. This thing's eating less and it's not hibernating as long. You end up with these skinnier or bonier sand eels, which means there's not enough food in the food chain as you go up, and so that's affecting the Atlantic puffin in this particular case, all because of a low fat or high fat copepod. So that is a trophic cascade where at one level, at the start of the level, you mess something up early on. Warmer seas, for example, because of global warming, you end up with a low-fat zooplankton. So you end up with skinny or absent sand eels because they can't get enough food. These voracious mackerel eat all these things. You end up with hungry seabirds, and you end up with dead chicks because there's just not enough food. So even though the food is still there, it's not of the same quality because there's not as much energy in it, all because of a low-fat copepod. And that affects a trophic cascade of events that happen all the way up this aquatic pyramid of biomass. All right, so we'll stop there for now, and I'll talk with you all soon. Thank you and have a good night.